Welcome to my channel of the Pateo. Narrative stories. Don't forget to subscribe button and press on the bell icon for more inspiration and mind-blowing stories. The sky was heavy, almost suffocating as dark clouds advanced like a silent army. Over the hills thunder rumbled in the distance, the sound reverberating through the packed dirt ground of the small ranch. Samson stood still in the corral, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He wasn't just a horse, he was a shadow of something greater, a forgotten legend. But now, with a coat marked by scars and a seemingly broken spirit, all that was left of him was silence. No one dared to get too close. In the distance, the growl of an engine broke through the somber air. An old battered pickup truck covered in dust slowly made its way up the driveway. Inside, James Harper, a 37-year-old man, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. His eyes were locked on the road ahead, but his mind was trapped in the past. He hadn't set foot on that ranch in years, not since he had lost everything: the army, his unit, and what was left of his own identity. But now he was back, and it was all because of that horse. As James stepped out of the truck, the rain began to fall in thick, heavy drops, staining the hat he wore to hide his slightly graying hair. He approached the corral slowly, as if each step carried an invisible weight. There stood Samson, his former partner, the horse who had saved his life more times than he could count. But something in Sam's gaze hit James like a dagger to the chest. It was empty, hollow, as if that animal was no longer the same Samson. James murmured, barely audible, as his eyes burned with emotion. He gripped the fence tightly and extended his hand, hoping for a sign. Anything, but Samson didn't move. Worse, he took a few steps back, letting out a soft whinny, as if the man in front of him was just a stranger. James felt a lump in his throat. He knew this reunion would be hard, but he wasn't prepared for this. In the distance, Jenny, a young ranch hand, watched everything unfold. She approached hesitantly. "He doesn't trust anyone," she said softly, looking at James especially. "Men, something happened to him." James turned to her, but didn't respond. He knew exactly what had happened. He knew why Samson was there, lost like a ghost, and that reason was something he carried as an invisible scar. The rain picked up, falling harder as James stood there, breathing heavily. He turned back to Samson and murmured more to himself than to the horse, "I can't fail you, not again." The rain fell like a heavy blanket over the ranch, turning the ground into mud and the fences into dark lines against the stormy sky. James stood there, motionless, staring at Samson with a mix of pain and determination. He wanted to believe the horse still recognized him, but the animal's distant, wary gaze said otherwise. A part of him wondered if it was already too late for both of them. Deep down, maybe this was a battle lost before it even began. James felt a tightness in his chest as old memories resurfaced, pulling him back to a night much like this one, but in a completely different place. The suffocating heat of the desert, the muffled screams, and the relentless sound of gunfire cut through the air. Samson was there, his eyes wild and his body drenched in sweat, but standing firm by James's side. They had survived together, faced dangers that seemed insurmountable, and now that bond felt broken like an invisible thread. That time and suffering had severed. "You're not like this," James whispered, as if Samson could understand. His voice trembled, heavy with a guilt he had never admitted out loud. "I failed you and everyone else." He stepped back slightly, running a hand over his wet face, unsure whether it was rain or tears. Jenny, still watching from a distance, took a step forward, but stopped when she saw James's expression. It was the look of someone lost, carrying a burden far heavier than they could bear. Samson let out a soft whinny, almost a groan. The sound cut through James in a way words never could. He knew the horse was suffering as much as he was, both trapped in a cycle of trauma that felt Impossible to break, perhaps that's why. They had been drawn back to each other, to survivors trying to make sense of the wreckage. The storm grew more intense, the wind howling around them like a reminder of the chaos surrounding them. But James refused to back down. "I'll make you remember," he said, this time more firmly, staring at Samson with a determination he hadn't felt in a long time. Even if the horse didn't recognize him now, James knew deep down their connection was still there. He just had to find it before it was too late. The next morning brought a clear, cold sky, but the atmosphere at the ranch remained heavy. James had spent the night in one of the small cabins meant for temporary workers, but sleep never came. He lay on the hard bed, staring at the wooden ceiling as flashes of the past overwhelmed his mind. The soldier screams, the thunder of explosions, and the sight of Samson running beside him through enemy fire. It all felt so distant yet so vividly alive. At dawn he headed to the pen. Samson was in the same spot, standing still like a statue, staring into the distance. The horse hadn't approached the fence, not even when Jenny brought fresh food and water. It was as if he were trapped in a constant state of alertness, unable to relax. James noticed it immediately. He recognized that look because he had felt it too. "I know what you're feeling," James murmured, leaning against the fence. His voice was low but heavy with emotion. "That feeling that you're still there, that you'll never leave even though the place is long gone." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "I didn't leave it behind, Samson, and it looks like you didn't either." Jenny, who had been watching from a distance while gathering the hay, finally approached. "You seem to know this horse well," she said, her voice soft but curious. James looked at her for a moment before responding. "He saved my life more than once." There was a weight to his words, something the young woman immediately noticed, but before she could ask more, James averted his gaze. He didn't want to talk about it, not yet. At least James knew he had to try something different. He stepped into the pen, his steps slow and deliberate. Samson perked up, his ears alert, but didn't move. James knelt down, bringing himself to the horse's eye level. "Do you remember?" he asked, his voice trembling. "The fields, the endless nights." He pulled something from his pocket, a small worn piece of leather, part of the equipment Samson had worn during the war. When Samson saw the object, his eyes briefly lit up, but only for a moment before returning to their usual emptiness. James felt a pang in his chest. Maybe Samson was trying to forget, just as he had tried unsuccessfully. The midday sun was shining brightly over the fence, but the heat didn't affect James or Samson. They stood there locked in a silent standoff. James held the piece of leather in his hand as if it were a key that could unlock buried memories, but Samson's gaze remained hard and yielding. It was like staring at an impenetrable wall. Frustrated, James took a few steps back, running his hands through his messy hair. He could feel the weight of disappointment growing. He had thought this small object would be enough to break the barrier between them, but he realized that Samson's trauma ran deeper than he had imagined, maybe even deeper than his own. "I just need a sign, kid," James murmured, his voice heavy with exhaustion and pain. Jenny watched from afar, pretending to be busy with the ranch chores, but she couldn't take her eyes off the interaction. There was something about that silent connection that intrigued her deeply. Finally she gathered the courage to approach. "You know this isn't going to be easy, right?" she said, crossing her arms. "He has more scars than any other horse here. Maybe some things are irreparable." James stared at her, his eyes flashing with stubbornness. "Hume's not beyond repair," he replied, his voice firmer than he intended. "I've seen what he's capable of. I've seen the heart he has that doesn't just disappear." He took a step towards Samson again, but this time he didn't try to force anything. He simply stood there, silently allowing the horse to sense his presence. And then something happened. It wasn't grand nor dramatic, but for James, it was enough. Samson slightly turned his head as if he were recognizing the man in front of him for the first time. It was an almost imperceptible movement, but James felt his heart race. It was the beginning of something, a small crack in the wall that separated him from his old companion. Samson's movement, small, almost imperceptible, was like a breath of hope in James's chest. He remained still, not moving, afraid that any sudden action might break that fragile moment. The silence around them felt heavier, interrupted only by the soft sound of the wind passing through the nearby trees. For the first time in years, James felt that he was not alone in the invisible weight he carried. Samson slightly tilted his ears toward James, but his body was still tense. He didn't move forward, didn't retreat, but that small gesture was more than James had expected after days of trying to reconnect. "You're still there, aren't you, boy?" James asked quietly, as if speaking to an old friend. His voice had a tone of vulnerability that he rarely allowed to show. Jenny, watching the scene, slowly approached, holding a bucket of water. She stopped a few steps away, trying not to interrupt the moment. "I've never seen him react like this," she said softly. Maybe you really mean something to him." The doubt in her voice was clear, but there was also a hint of curiosity. Jenny didn't fully understand the bond James had with that horse, but she was starting to realize it was something far beyond the ordinary. James began to realize that it was something far beyond the ordinary. He sighed, still looking at Samson. "He saved me when no one else could," he said, his voice heavy with a pain Jenny hadn't expected to hear. "We were in a valley surrounded. I thought it was the end, but he didn't hesitate. He faced the fire, the smoke, and pulled me out of there." He paused, looking at the ground before continuing, "And I promised him I'd never leave him behind, but that's exactly what I did." The confession hung in the air as heavy as lead. Samson moved his head again, as if he had heard something familiar in James' voice. The horse took a single step forward, its hoof sinking into the soft earth. James couldn't help the shy smile that formed on his face, a smile full of hope mixed with regret. He knew that small step was just the beginning, but it was a beginning. The sound of hoofs striking the ground brought a brief sense of relief to James' heart. Samson had taken another step toward him, but then stopped, as if something invisible was still holding him back. The horse lowered his head, his eyes fixed on the ground, and the moment of connection almost slipped away. James knew forcing him would be pointless. Instead, he knelt right there in the mud, trying to lower himself to the animal's level, just like he had during training. "You don't have to be scared, boy, not in anymore," he said, his voice soft, heavy with emotion. The silence was broken by a sound in the distance, the roar of a helicopter crossing the sky. Samson froze, his ears shot forward, and the wild gleam that had disappeared from his eyes returned. For a moment, James felt the change in the air, as if he had been transported back to the battlefield. He knew what was happening. Samson was reliving the sound of the helicopter, was a trigger, a memory so vivid it felt real. James stayed steady, watching as Samson trembled, muscles tensed, while he neighed louder than he ever had before. The horse began to circle within the pen, his tail whipping from side to side as if ready to run or fight. Jenny ran to the fence, her eyes wide. "He's losing it, James, do something," she shouted, but James raised his hand, signaling for her not to interfere. "Samson, listen to me," exclaimed his voice, strong but full of urgency. He walked toward the center of the pen, his hands open in a gesture of calm. Each step felt like a risk, but he didn't hesitate. "You're safe now, it's over, boy, it's over." His tone was firm, but not aggressive, and for a moment Samson stopped. The horse was panting, its chest rising and falling quickly, as if the weight of its memories was pressing it to the limit. Then Something changed. Samson lifted his head and looked at James, his eyes filled with what seemed like a mixture of confusion and recognition. He took another step, then another, until he finally stopped in front of James. The man reached out, his fingers trembling, and gently touched the horse's forehead. "We're in this together," James whispered, and in that moment he knew he wasn't just helping Samson heal, he was also facing his own ghost. Samson didn't pull back at James' touch. It was a brief moment, but one filled with meaning, an instant when two survivors marked by the same invisible scars finally met. James stood still, his hand resting on the horse's forehead, feeling the warmth and life pulsing beneath the scarred coat. Samson's breathing, once erratic, began to steady, though the frightened gleam in his eyes hadn't completely faded. "You remember me, don't you?" James murmured, his voice filled with a mix of hope and pain, but he knew that this connection wasn't enough to erase the years of suffering they both carried. Samson was like a mirror reflecting back the traumas James had spent his whole life trying to bury, but now looking at the horse, he knew he couldn't run anymore. Jenny, watching the scene with a racing heart, took a few hesitant steps toward the fence. "I've never seen anything like this," she said, almost in a whisper. "How do you do it?" "He barely lets anyone get close," and now her voice faltered as she tried to find the right words to describe what she was witnessing. James didn't answer immediately. He pulled his hand away from Samson and took a few steps back, giving the horse space to decide what to do. "It's not magic," he said, finally, not taking his eyes off Samson. "It's pain. Pain connects us in ways people don't understand. He knows I carry something just like he does." Samson began to walk slowly around the pen, but this time his movements were neither frantic nor filled with panic. He was calm, though still alert. James watched every step, looking for signs that would tell him what to do next. Then he noticed a slight shift in Samson's gait, a stiffness in the rind leg. The horse was limping, and James frowned. "He's hurt," James said, turning to Jenny. "This kind of pain isn't just emotional. He's carrying something in his body." To Jenny nodded, looking concerned. "I'll call the vet," she said quickly, but James interrupted with a gesture. "No, let me take care of it. If he really recognizes me, then I'm the one he will trust." Jenny hesitated, but something in James's expression convinced her. She gave a small nod before stepping away, leaving the two of them alone again. James knew he was dealing with much more than physical injuries. Samson was a complex puzzle, a broken soul who needed time, patience, and above all, redemption. The man took a deep breath, preparing for the next step, fully aware that in order to heal the horse, he would also need to face the parts of himself he had been avoiding for years. James ran his hands along the sides of his head, trying to organize his thoughts as he watched Samson struggle to walk around the pen. The stiffness in the horse's leg was more noticeable now. Each step weighed down by effort. James knew that physical pain, just like emotional pain, could be devastating, especially for an animal like Samson, who had been trained to endure anything without hesitation. But no one, not even a war horse, was invincible. He grabbed a bucket of clean water and the cloth, slowly re-entering the pen. Samson stopped, his ears flicking back in alert, but he didn't back away. "Like before, it's okay, boy," James said in a low, soothing tone, kneeling beside the horse. "I'm not going to hurt you." Carefully, he wiped the cloth across Samson's hind leg, looking for signs of injury. When he touched a more sensitive spot, Samson and loudly and stepped to the side, nearly hitting James with his hoof. I know, James murmured, pulling back just enough to avoid startling him. "It hurts, but we need to fix this." He felt an unsettling familiarity in Samson's reaction during the years of war. There had been moments when James had also recoiled from the touch of a doctor or a friend, the trauma making even care feel Unbearable now he saw the same reflection in Samson while working. Carefully James began to speak, not exactly to Samson, but to himself, to the emptiness around him. I should have come back for you, he said, his voice heavy with guilt. I should have fought harder to get you out of that place, but I was broken, kid. I was just trying to survive. He stopped, swallowing hard as painful memories filled his mind. They said you had disappeared, that they couldn't find you. In the chaos I believed them because it was easier than admitting that maybe I could have done more. Samson lowered his head slightly, his eyes shining as if something in James's words made sense. The man stood up, taking a deep breath. But I'm here now, he continued, his voice gaining strength, and we're going to fix this. You've saved me so many times, Samson. Now it's my turn to save you. After a few minutes, James was able to examine Samson's hoof more closely. There was a slight swelling, maybe from an old injury that had never been properly treated. He knew it would take time and patience, but it wasn't impossible to heal. When he finished, he gently stroked the horse's neck. Samson didn't pull away. This time it was a small step, but to James it meant everything. The sunset painted the sky with warm colors as James watched Samson from outside the enclosure. The horse was calmer, its movements less hesitant, but there was still an emotional distance that seemed insurmountable. James felt the weight of this barrier and knew it wouldn't be easy to overcome. He slipped one hand into his pocket, feeling the small metal bell he had found among his old belongings. That object had been a symbol of survival for both of them during tough times, and he hoped it could now become a symbol of reconnection. Jenny, who was nearby gathering hay, noticed James' thoughtful expression and approached him. Are you okay? She asked, offering a shy smile. He nodded slowly, but didn't look away from Samson. It's strange, he replied, being so close to him and yet feeling like we're miles apart. Jenny placed her hand on James' shoulder, offering a silent gesture of support. Why does he mean so much to you? She asked, curious yet cautious. James took a deep breath before answering. Because he saved my life, not once but several times, and I promised I would never leave him behind. His voice carried a weight that Jenny hadn't expected. She realized that the bond between them was deeper than anyone could imagine. While they were talking, Samson approached the fence, watching James with cautious curiosity. It was a small but meaningful movement. Jenny smiled as she noticed. I think he's starting to trust again, she said, trying to inject a bit of optimism into the conversation. James nodded, but his eyes revealed that he knew the road ahead would still be long. The next morning at dawn, James walked to the enclosure with the bell in his hand. He gently shook it, producing a metallic sound that echoed through the air. Samson lifted his head, his ears picking up the familiar sound. Slowly he took a few steps toward James, his eyes shining with a mix of recognition and caution. It was a brief moment, but it rekindled James' hope. You remember this, don't you, boy? James murmured, trying to hold back the emotion in his voice. He knew that simple gesture meant more than it seemed. The sound of the bell was a reminder of the days when the trust between them was unshakable. Now it was a promise that they could rebuild that together. The silence in the old training ground was absolute, except for the soft sound of the wind moving through the leaves. James remained still as Samson explored the area, each step of the horse echoing like a distant reminder of the past. The yard where they had trained was unrecognizable, overtaken by vegetation and time, but there was something in the air, a weight, a collective memory that seemed to pulse between them. For Samson, the place stirred something long dormant. For James, it was the chance to finally what he had been avoiding. James opened the pocket of his jacket and took out the small metal bell. He shook the object, its sound reverberating through the air like a familiar melody filled with history. Samson froze, his ears perking up. Immediately his eyes locked onto the bell, and he took a small step forward. Hesitant, "You remember this, don't you, boy?" James whispered, feeling his throat tighten. The bell was a symbol of the moments when they had trusted each other to survive. Now it was a reminder that they could still heal together. The horse moved closer, almost touching James with his nose. It was a small gesture, but one full of meaning. James let the bell fall to the ground, its sound muffled against the earth. "I left you behind, Samson," he confessed, his voice low and trembling. "I thought I was doing the right thing, that you'd be safe without me, but the truth is I was scared of facing everything we lost." He took a deep breath, feeling the words come out with difficulty. "But I'm here now, and we can move forward together." Samson lifted his head, his gaze meeting James's. It was as if in that moment something broke a hidden barrier that had kept them apart. The horse gave a soft whinny, a sound James recognized as acceptance. He reached out and touched Samson's forehead, feeling the connection he thought he had lost forever. A deep sense of relief washed over him, and for the first time in years James felt there was a path ahead. Jenny arrived shortly after. Watching the scene from a distance, she said nothing, just stood there with a calm smile on her face. She knew something deep had changed, something that didn't need explanation. James and Samson had found each other again, and in doing so had also found the hope they had lost. As the sun began to set, James and Samson walked together across the field just as they had in the old days. It wasn't just a walk, it was a symbol of a new beginning. The past couldn't be erased, but they had decided they would no longer be prisoners of it, and in that shared silence they both found something more valuable than memory: the strength to move forward. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. For more content, please leave your comments and share your experiences. Thank you for being part of the Pateo Narrative Stories community. See you soon.